Good evening, and welcome back to Logic Bridge. If you have followed the news over the last decade, you have likely noticed a recurring pattern in how our country handles immigration. It is a cycle that has become almost predictable. We hear about a surge or a crisis at the border, followed by a flurry of unilateral activity from the White House, which is then followed immediately by a wave of lawsuits in federal court. Then, a few years later, a new administration takes office, flips the script entirely, and the cycle repeats. For those of us who remember the legislative debates of the 1980s or even the early 2000s, this feels fundamentally different. We have moved away from a system where immigration policy is debated in the halls of Congress and signed into lasting law. Instead, we have entered an era of policy by decree. Today is February 12th, 2026. As we look at the current landscape, marked by recent mandates for mass detention and intense legal battles over birthright citizenship, it is vital to step back from the daily headlines. We need to ask a difficult question. What happens to a country when its most complex social issue is managed through temporary executive orders rather than permanent legislation? The research shows that these temporary fixes are creating permanent demographic and fiscal realities. They have created a phenomenon known as policy whiplash, where the rules change so frequently that neither the migrants, the employers, nor the local governments know where they stand. We will examine the evidence regarding the fiscal impact on our communities, the breakdown of the democratic process, and the long-term consequences of bypassing Congress. To understand where we are in 2026, we have to look back at how we got here. The shift toward executive-led policy began in earnest in 2012. At that time, the Obama administration implemented DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was framed as a temporary measure to provide work permits to roughly 800,000 individuals. Regardless of one's view on the policy itself, it marked a structural turning point. The executive branch began using discretion to create broad programs that Congress had explicitly declined to authorize. Then came the pendulum swing. Between 2017 and 2021, the Trump administration enacted a staggering 472 administrative changes. This averaged out to one policy change every 3 days. These included the Remain in Mexico policy and the use of Title 42 to expel migrants during the pandemic. When the Biden administration took over in 2021, the pendulum swung back. They rescinded many of the previous orders and expanded humanitarian parole for specific nationalities, such as Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. By 2024, however, that same administration was forced to issue its own restrictive executive orders to manage surges at the border. Now, in 2025 and 2026, we are seeing the latest shift toward mass detention and new interpretations of the Alien Enemies Act. This high frequency of change creates what experts call liminal legality. Imagine being a business owner or a local school superintendent trying to plan for next year when the legal status of the population you serve is being granted, revoked, and reinstated by court orders every few months. This volatility isn't just a political talking point. It is a structural instability that makes long-term planning impossible for our communities. In our current discourse, two dominant narratives compete for our attention. The first is the necessity narrative. Proponents argue that the president must act because Congress has failed to pass a comprehensive immigration bill for over 30 years. From this perspective, the executive branch is simply using every available tool to manage humanitarian crises and meet the labor needs of the American economy. The second is the rule of law narrative. Skeptics argue that this executive overreach bypasses the democratic process. They contend that by using parole loopholes to admit large numbers of people, the executive branch is incentivizing illegal crossings and imposing unfunded mandates on states without their consent. In this view, when the president acts without Congress, he is shifting the cost of federal policy onto the shoulders of local taxpayers. One of the most significant pieces of evidence we have comes from a mid-2025 report by the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. Their findings regarding the immigration surge that began in 2021 are sobering. The CBO found that in 2023 alone, the immigration surge imposed a direct net cost of $9.2 billion on state and local governments. While the surge generated about $10.1 billion in state and local tax revenue, the cost of providing services to that same population reached $19.3 billion. When we break down those costs, the primary driver is education. K-12 schooling for the children of migrants represents over 50% of the total cost increase. Unlike the federal government, which can run a deficit, local school districts must balance their budgets. When a local population grows rapidly, the demand for teachers and classrooms rises immediately, but property tax revenues often take years to adjust. Research from the Manhattan Institute suggests that the fiscal impact is highly contingent on skill level. High-skilled immigrants typically provide a net lifetime surplus of millions of dollars to the U.S. economy. On the other hand, low-skilled immigrants often remain a net fiscal drain at the local level due to lower taxable income and higher service utilization. When policy is driven by executive parole programs, it can act as a pull factor that increases the backlog of the asylum court system, which currently exceeds 3 million cases. The last major reform was the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, or IRCA. It granted amnesty but promised strict worksite enforcement. However, that enforcement was never fully implemented, leading to a massive fake document industry. This failure created the skepticism we see today. Fast forward to the 2024 Senate Border Act. It failed because opponents argued it codified high levels of illegal crossings, the 5,000 per day trigger, and granted too much discretion to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Executive action often prevents compromise by allowing both parties to avoid the political risk of a permanent legislative deal. We must address the arguments for the current system fairly. Proponents argue that the U.S. economy requires these workers to prevent contraction in agriculture and construction. However, an endless supply of low-skilled labor can suppress wage growth for native-born workers with only a high school diploma. Regarding asylum, many believe border arrivals have a legal right to enter. Yet primary legal texts like Section 212F of the INA grant the President broad authority to suspend entry. This conflict is currently tied up in federal litigation. As we stand here in February of 2026, the primary lesson is that temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent. When we bypass the legislative process, we trade stability for speed. The $9.2 billion net cost to our states is the result of a federal government that sets the policy but leaves the local community to manage the consequences. True reform requires the permanence that only a law can provide. Until Congress resumes its constitutional role, we will likely remain in this cycle of temporary fixes and permanent effects. Thank you for joining us today on Logic Bridge. If you appreciate this kind of data-driven analysis and reasoned discussion, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and upvote this video. Your support helps us reach a wider audience and continue providing these deep dives into the issues that matter. We also want to hear from you. Do you see these fiscal impacts in your own community? What is your perspective on the shift from legislative to executive action? Please provide any criticism or further discussion in the comments below. We value a thoughtful exchange of ideas and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Until next time, I'm your host for Logic Bridge.